Chosen one, listen carefully. You didn't find this message by accident. God brought you here because something hidden is about to be revealed, and what you're about to discover may change everything. Let me begin with something that most people don't want to admit. Sometimes the story you were given about your family is not the complete story. Every family has memories it celebrates, moments it repeats, names it honors, and events it would rather never discuss. We grow up believing that what our parents told us about where we came from is the truth, and most of the time it may be. But sometimes there are missing pieces, conversations that never happened, documents that disappeared, relationships that were never explained, and decisions made long before we were old enough to understand them. And when one missing piece suddenly comes back into your life, it can change the way you see everything. Imagine discovering that there is a man somewhere who has information about your father that you were never told. Maybe he has an old photograph. Maybe he remembers a conversation from decades ago. Maybe he possesses a letter, a document, or simply a first-hand account of something that happened before you were born. The object itself may be small, but what it represents can be enormous. Because human beings don't simply live with facts. We live with stories. Your identity is partly constructed from the stories you have been told about yourself. You were told who your parents were, what they valued, what they struggled with, where your family came from, and perhaps even why certain relationships ended. Over time, these stories become part of your internal map of reality. You don't question every detail because you don't have a reason to. You trust the people who raised you. That is why discovering a hidden truth can feel so destabilizing. It isn't just information, it can feel like an attack on the foundation of your identity. You may suddenly ask questions you never thought to ask. Why did my father behave that way? Why was this person never mentioned? Why did certain relatives avoid one another? Why was that particular period of his life always described vaguely? Why does someone else remember the past differently? And here's where wisdom becomes essential. When emotions rise, our minds want immediate conclusions. We want someone to be right and someone else to be wrong. We want to assign blame. We want the mystery solved instantly. But truth does not become more truthful simply because we are emotionally convinced of it. Real maturity is the ability to pause. If someone comes forward claiming to have proof about your father, don't allow shock to become your judge. Listen, examine, ask questions. Separate what is known from what is assumed. Separate evidence from interpretation. Because one of the greatest mistakes people make is confusing a powerful story with a proven fact. But don't make the opposite mistake either. Don't reject uncomfortable information simply because it threatens the version of reality you have become comfortable with. There is a profound psychological principle here. We often protect familiar beliefs not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Familiarity creates emotional security. Even painful explanations can feel safer than uncertain ones. So when the truth challenges your family's story, your first responsibility is not to defend the story. Your first responsibility is to seek understanding. Perhaps what you discover will change your opinion of your father. Perhaps it will deepen your compassion for him. Perhaps it will reveal mistakes he made. Perhaps it will uncover circumstances you never knew existed. Or perhaps the supposed secret will turn out to be something far less dramatic than people imagined. But whatever the truth is, you become stronger when you are willing to face it. Because your family's past deserves honesty, but your future deserves freedom. You cannot change what happened before you were born. You can only decide what you will do with the truth once you encounter it. And sometimes the first step toward healing a family is simply having the courage to stop pretending that there are no unanswered questions. The truth may shake your story, but it does not have to shatter you. Now consider the possibility that the most important part of this story is not the secret itself, but the person who has been carrying it. Because if a man has information about your father that has remained hidden for years, the natural question is not simply, what does he know? The deeper question is, why has he waited until now to say it? That question matters because silence always has a reason. Sometimes people remain silent because they are afraid, sometimes because they believe they are protecting someone, sometimes because they feel guilty, and sometimes They simply don't know how to reopen a chapter of the past without causing pain to everyone who has built their life around a different version of events. Think about how difficult it can be to tell someone something that might completely change their understanding of a parent. Imagine knowing something about a person's father and carrying that knowledge for 10, 20, or even 40 years. Every birthday, every family gathering, every photograph could become a reminder of what you know but cannot say. That kind of silence creates psychological pressure. We often assume that people hide secrets because they don't care, but sometimes the opposite is true. A person may remain silent precisely because they care too much about the consequences of speaking. Perhaps this man promised someone that he would never reveal what happened. Perhaps your father asked him to remain quiet. Perhaps an older relative warned him that exposing the truth would destroy relationships. Or perhaps he was simply waiting until the people involved were strong enough to handle what he knew. And then there is another possibility. Maybe he stayed silent because he was afraid that no one would believe him. This is where human psychology becomes fascinating. When a secret conflicts with an established family narrative, the person revealing it can become the target rather than the truth being examined. People often defend familiar stories because those stories give them emotional stability, so the messenger can become more threatening than the message. But if this man truly has evidence, then his responsibility is not merely to make a dramatic accusation. His responsibility is to present what he knows clearly, and your responsibility is not to blindly believe him or blindly reject him. Your responsibility is to investigate, ask what he actually knows, ask how he knows it, ask whether he witnessed something personally or heard it from someone else, ask whether there are documents, photographs, letters, dates, or other independent evidence. Ask questions without anger. Listen without surrendering your judgment. Because truth does not fear careful examination. And there is something else you need to understand. People are complicated. Your father was not simply your father. Before he became your father, he was a young man with fears, ambitions, weaknesses, mistakes, relationships, dreams, and decisions you may know nothing about. That doesn't excuse wrongdoing, but it gives you a larger lens through which to understand the person behind the role. Sometimes we turn our parents into symbols. We make them heroes or villains based on limited memories. But real human beings are rarely that simple. Perhaps this man is bringing you a painful truth. Perhaps he is bringing you a misunderstood truth. Perhaps he is even bringing you information that needs to be challenged. Whatever the case, don't allow curiosity to become gossip, and don't allow emotion to become judgment. Seek clarity, because when a hidden story finally comes to the surface, the greatest question is not, who should I blame? The greatest question is, what can I learn from the truth? That question changes everything. And remember this, sometimes the person who finally speaks is not trying to destroy your family story. He may be giving you the chance to understand it for the first time. And now we come to the part that can be the most difficult to face. What happens when the evidence actually changes what you believed about your father? Because there is a difference between hearing a rumor and encountering something that demands your attention. A rumor can be dismissed. A story can be questioned. But when a photograph, letter, official document, first-hand testimony, or other credible evidence appears, you may suddenly find yourself standing between two versions of reality, the one you grew up believing and the one the evidence seems to reveal. And psychologically, that can create an enormous internal conflict. You may feel almost as if you're betraying your father by questioning the story you were given. You may think, how can I believe this after everything he taught me? But understanding the truth about someone's past does not erase every good thing they ever did. Human beings are not single events. A person can make mistakes and still love their children. A person can hide something and still have moments of genuine sacrifice. A person can carry regret without ever knowing how to talk about it. This is why maturity requires us to resist simple conclusions. If the evidence reveals something difficult about your father, don't immediately turn him into a monster, but don't automatically protect him either. The goal is not to defend an image. The goal is to understand reality, and that distinction is incredibly important. Because sometimes we don't actually love people as they are. Sometimes we love the version of them that exists inside our memory. We remember the father who held our hand, taught us something, protected us, or worked hard for the family. Those memories may be completely real, but they may not represent the entire person. Likewise, if you discover something negative, don't allow one revelation to erase everything else. The human mind wants categories: good or bad, innocent or guilty, truth or lie. But life is usually more complicated than that. Maybe the evidence reveals that your father had a relationship before the family knew about it. Maybe it reveals a decision he made when he was young. Maybe there was another family connection that nobody discussed. Maybe a document changes what you thought you knew about your family's history. Whatever the revelation may be, the deeper challenge is learning how to hold complicated truths without allowing them to destroy your emotional stability. This is where self-control becomes more powerful than shock. You don't have to react immediately. You don't have to confront everyone tonight. You don't have to make a permanent decision while experiencing a temporary emotional storm. Take the evidence seriously, but take your emotions seriously too. Give yourself enough space to process what you're learning. Talk to trustworthy people when necessary. Verify important claims. If documents are involved, examine their authenticity. If another person's reputation or identity is at stake, remember that accusations require responsibility, because truth without wisdom can become another form of destruction. And perhaps the most profound lesson is this: discovering something about your father does not mean you have discovered something about your own worth. Children often internalize the history of their parents. They think, if my father did this, what does that say about me? But your father's decisions belong to his life. Your choices belong to yours. You inherited a family history. You did not inherit an obligation to repeat it. Maybe this revelation will change your understanding of where you came from. Maybe it will answer questions you've carried silently for years. Maybe it will expose pain that previous generations refused to confront. But remember, knowledge is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of responsibility. Once you know more, you have the opportunity to choose differently. You can build relationships based on honesty. You can refuse to pass secrecy forward. You can teach the next generation that difficult truths are not something to fear. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can inherit from your family is not its secrets. It is the courage to end the silence. There is something deeper happening whenever a family protects a secret for years. The secret itself may be only one event, one relationship, one decision, or one painful chapter. But the silence surrounding it can become much larger than the original event. It can shape how people communicate, how children understand their parents, and how entire generations learn what they are allowed to talk about. Think about what happens in a family when everyone knows something, but nobody says it. A child notices the strange silence when a particular name is mentioned. They notice that certain photographs are missing. They notice that two relatives never sit together. They notice that someone becomes uncomfortable whenever the past comes up. Nobody explains anything, but the child learns that there is a subject they are not supposed to touch, and eventually silence becomes tradition. This is one of the most powerful things about family secrets. They can be passed down without the actual story being passed down. A generation may inherit the tension without understanding its origin. They inherit suspicion, distance, resentment, or fear, but they don't know where those emotions began. Someone decades earlier made a decision, and people generations later are still living with the consequences. Why does this happen? Because families are not only biological systems, they are psychological systems. Every family develops patterns, ways of communicating, ways of avoiding conflict, ways of protecting reputation, and ways of responding to pain. Some families say everything. Other families survive by saying almost nothing. And sometimes silence begins with what appears to be a good intention. Someone thinks, if I tell the children, I'll hurt them. Another thinks, there is no reason to bring the past back. Someone else says, we need to protect the family's reputation. And perhaps another person simply believes they are better off not knowing. But here's the problem. What you refuse to explain does not necessarily disappear. It can remain beneath the surface. Children are incredibly sensitive to emotional inconsistencies. Even when nobody tells them the truth, they can often sense that something is wrong. They may not know the facts, but they feel the tension. And when people don't receive an explanation, the mind creates one. That is where imagination can become more damaging than reality. A child may assume they were unwanted. They may believe their father didn't love them. They may blame themselves for family conflict. They may create an explanation that is far more painful than the actual truth. This is why honest communication matters. Not every secret needs to be revealed in every circumstance, and not every piece of private history needs to become public. Wisdom requires boundaries, but there is a profound difference between protecting someone's dignity and protecting a false narrative. One preserves humanity, the other can preserve confusion. And when the man with the evidence finally enters the story, he may not simply be revealing something about your father. He may be exposing a pattern of silence that has existed for generations. That is why the revelation can feel like it shakes the entire family tree, because one truth can force people to revisit hundreds of assumptions. Suddenly, old arguments may look different. Old relationships may make more sense. Certain decisions may become understandable. A relative who was considered bitter may have been carrying information nobody knew. Someone who seemed distant may have been protecting a painful memory. And yet, this is where you must be careful. Understanding the reason behind someone's behavior does not mean you have to approve of everything they did. Compassion and accountability can exist together. You can say, "Now I understand why you made that decision," without saying, "Therefore, everything you did was right." That is emotional maturity. The goal is not to dig into the past simply to find someone to blame. The goal is to understand the past well enough that it no longer controls the future. Because your family tree is not only made of names and dates, it is made of patterns. And if you can recognize those patterns, you can decide which ones continue through you and which ones end with you. Maybe your family taught you to hide pain. You can choose honesty. Maybe your family taught you to avoid difficult conversations. You can choose courage. Maybe your family carried shame for generations. You can choose understanding. That is how a painful revelation can become something more than a scandal. It can become a turning point. Because sometimes the truth does not arrive to destroy a family. Sometimes it arrives to give the next generation permission to live differently. And eventually, there comes a moment when the hidden truth can no longer remain hidden. Someone speaks, a document is opened, an old photograph is finally explained, a conversation that was postponed for decades finally happens. And when that moment arrives, the most important question is not simply what the truth reveals, but what you will do with it. Because revelation is powerful, but revelation alone does not create healing. Sometimes people imagine that once the truth comes out, everything will immediately make sense. But real life doesn't work that way. Truth can bring relief, but it can also bring grief. It can answer one question while creating 10 more. It can explain someone's behavior while simultaneously forcing you to reconsider memories you thought you understood. You may feel anger, you may feel betrayed, you may feel sadness for your father, for yourself, or even for people who are no longer alive to explain their decisions. And you may feel something surprisingly different, relief, because uncertainty can be exhausting. For years, you may have sensed that something about the family story didn't quite fit. Perhaps certain details never made sense. Perhaps there were contradictions. Perhaps you noticed that people became uncomfortable whenever the past was mentioned. When the truth finally emerges, even a painful truth can sometimes feel strangely liberating. Why? Because the human mind wants coherence. We want our experiences to fit together. We want to understand why people behaved the way they did. We want the past to have some kind of structure. When important pieces are missing, the mind keeps searching. That is why family secrets can have such long psychological shadows. But once the evidence appears, you have a choice. You can use the truth as a weapon, or you can use it as a mirror. A weapon asks, "Who can I punish for this?" A mirror asks, "What does this teach me?" Those are completely different questions. If you choose the first, the revelation may create another generation of anger. One person blames another. Another person defends themselves. Someone brings up an old mistake. Someone else reveals another secret. Soon the family is no longer discussing the truth. They are fighting over it. But if you choose the second approach, something different becomes possible. You can begin asking better questions. What actually happened? Who was affected? Why did people remain silent? What fears influenced their decisions? What consequences continued afterward? And most importantly, what can be changed now? This does not mean pretending that wrongdoing didn't happen. Forgiveness is not denial. Understanding is not approval. Moving forward does not require you to rewrite the past. It requires you to stop allowing the past to dictate every decision you make today. Imagine a family where generations have been shaped by one hidden event. Maybe people stopped trusting one another. Maybe certain relatives became enemies. Maybe children were given incomplete explanations. Maybe resentment quietly passed from parent to child. Then someone finally discovers the truth. At first, everything shakes, but perhaps that shaking is necessary. Sometimes a structure has to be disturbed before you can discover which parts need repair. The revelation may force people to have conversations they avoided for years. It may allow someone to apologize. It may give another person permission to grieve. It may even allow family members to recognize that they were all carrying different pieces of the same incomplete story. And sometimes the greatest healing is not getting everyone to agree. Sometimes healing means finally being able to disagree without hatred. You may never see your father exactly as you did before, and that is okay. Your understanding may become more complicated, but complicated does not necessarily mean worse. Sometimes maturity means replacing a simplistic image with a more complete one. Your father can be remembered for the good he did while you acknowledge the mistakes he made. You can honor the love you received without denying the pain that existed. You can recognize the truth without becoming trapped inside it. And if the revelation changes your family tree, let it change the direction of the branches, not simply break them. Because the purpose of truth is not destruction. The purpose of truth is freedom, and what you do with that freedom becomes your legacy.